My name is Courtney Tolmie. I am a senior fellow with Results for Development, working on the intersection between monitoring, evaluation, and learning, and open governance, transparency, and accountability. I'm also the founder and lead of Wonderlight Consulting. So maybe starting with the question of how do you report on context within an intervention? I think that there's a few different ways that you can report on context, and it depends a little bit on what your goals are from both a research and a practice perspective. And I think of these a little bit from the perspective of moving from a very broad but probably shallow dive into context into a pretty deep dive into context if there are particular things that you're really looking at. So starting with the broad, I think at the very least, it's really important for anyone that's either reading research or information about social accountability to understand just some basic information about where the intervention is happening. And I tend to think of this in terms of three factors. So people, process, and place. I think it's just a helpful way to think about what are the important pieces of context. So people, it's kind of the who is involved, and that could be both the practitioners, the civil society organizations, or people that are directly involved in the social accountability. It can also be the community, frontline service providers, people like that. I think one piece we often forget as researchers is the who of the researcher. So who is supporting this, who's in the space collecting data, who's analyzing it, and who's also funding and supporting that research. Because I think all of those are really important pieces that can help explain what's happening in an intervention. So that's the people. The process, I think, is kind of spans the space between what is context and what's the actual intervention itself. But I do think that there are some elements of the process of doing social accountability, doing that program, that I think are important to look at and can kind of move into the context space. So, you know, for example, how the process was designed, who was involved in that design process, what was taking place when the social accountability program was being undertaken. And then the final piece of this is place. And place can basically mean anything kind of externally contextual. So where the work is happening, what else is going on at the time? Are there elections happening? Are there other kind of external shocks happening at the time? Really anything else that we tend to think of as context. So at the very least, I think having that really broad understanding of just where and who and how this work is happening. As you get a little bit deeper, and this was something we did in the Transparency for Development project, which I was involved in over the course of about 7 years. If there are particular elements of context that we think are playing a really important role in social accountability, I think there's more opportunities to actually research those and report on those directly. But that's going to depend a little bit on what your interests are and what you think are the big roles that are being played. So for example, with the work we did on the Transparency for Development or T4D project, we were very interested in elements of power dynamics, empowerment issues, things like that among the people who were involved in the social accountability. So largely community representatives that were involved in these community scorecard processes. Because we were really interested in understanding power dynamics and shifting power dynamics in particular, we took a much kind of deeper dive approach when it came to looking at that element of context. So for us, that included having ethnographers that were embedded into several of the communities where we were working to really get a better understanding of how people were experiencing this social accountability work. It also involved doing direct meeting observations. So we had researchers who would sit in on some of these meetings where community members were working together, or in some cases working in opposition, to identify what some of the biggest problems were they wanted to address and how they would address them. And having these independent researchers be able to observe those dynamics really helped us to get a better understanding of what was happening. And then we also did some work on vignettes where, it's really hard to ask someone, do you feel empowered? How do you answer that question? I don't know how I would answer that question. But one thing we did was we used these kind of write-ups, these short stories or vignettes where we spoke with different community members who were involved in the social accountability and kind of gave them these different scenarios, these third-party scenarios that related to empowerment and power dynamics, and ask them to let us know which of them they associated with the most. And so again, it's one of those ways that if you're looking to do a really deep dive into a particular context issue, I think that's very worth doing. But from my perspective, at the least, when you're looking at kind of social accountability more broadly, I think understanding and reporting on things like where this is happening and the moment in time this is happening in, the place, what happened, the process, and then that who, both the social accountability practitioners, the community, and then also the researchers and supporters really is important just to kind of understand in what space this is happening in. So on the question of how do you balance the structural and the human level when reporting on context, this can be a really difficult balance to hit. And I think a lot of it also depends on the resources that you have to be able to look at both sides of context. With the T4D project, which I talked about a little bit earlier, we were very privileged in the sense that we had a long time to look at this work. We were working in 5 different countries, so there was an ability to really do some comparisons across different places. And we were well resourced in terms of the research and data collection that we were able to do to really look at context. But what we did really try to do with our work is take these different elements of context that we thought were especially important and to look at them from both a more, I guess I would say, objective side and subjective side. So what were the perceptions of the people that were involved in social accountability, the social accountability intervention, in terms of what they experienced and what they observed related to context and what they felt was important. And then what were ways that we could actually measure these more objectively? And I think sometimes when we talk about objective versus subjective, there's a very natural tendency to say, well, the objective is better. The subjective is kind of your second choice. I actually don't think that's the case in social accountability, because so much of how social accountability plays out is how the people who are involved experience and perceive it. So even if, objectively a certain contextual factor doesn't seem like it should make as big of a difference, if everyone in a community that's involved in a scorecard or a social audit or something like that believes that something like the cultural background or the perceptions of the midwife in a village make a difference, then that perception is really important. So in terms of how you address that as a researcher, I think the first thing to do is to, if possible, really try to prioritize what contextual factors that you're hypothesizing are going to be the most important so that you can look at them from both an objective and a subjective perspective. Once you've done that, I think that on the objective side, if you are collecting additional data through things like a randomized control trial, another quantitative or qualitative kind of large scale survey that you're looking at, trying to build context directly into that is incredibly helpful because it does provide that sort of perspective of just what's going on, from a very tangible level at a given point in time. And that could be things like what's going on in the health system, if the social accountability program is focused on health, what's happening in facilities, are there actual stockouts, are they well staffed enough, things like that. It can also be issues related to civic space and civil liberties. Those are the types of things that we can also really look at using surveys. And then the other piece of this, the kind of perceptions and experiences, I always think that having key informant interviews and other qualitative data collection, even if your main research is quantitative, having that sort of parallel qualitative data collection is incredibly helpful and oftentimes helps tell the full story in a way that the numbers can't. So once you have things like key informant interviews, focus group discussions, things like that, it becomes really easy to bring in some questions to participants, to social accountability partners, about what they see as the important factors. What are they seeing as the contextual factors that are either helping or hindering a particular program to move forward, or, like I said, to stall? Um, and especially if you have enough of these key informed interviews, enough of these focus group discussions, even though it's, quote unquote, just someone's perspective, if you start hearing the same thing over and over again from multiple different independent sources, it really can provide, I think, a lot of insight into what might be happening behind the scenes, what some of those contextual issues are that may be really hard to gather in a survey that actually end up making a big difference in terms of a particular social accountability intervention moving forward or not. So that's, I think, one big way that I would think about balancing the structural, those kind of harder factors, with the human level, the softer factors. And I think really trying to look at both of them from these multiple different perspectives is incredibly important. The question of how does context inform your definition of social accountability before and during the intervention? This is something that I've definitely grappled with a lot in the process of both supporting social accountability programs, which was kind of what I did in my past life, and then also doing research and being a learning partner on social accountability programs. And I think part of the issue here is that we as a field don't have a great consistent definition of social accountability. A lot of people think of it as meaning different things. And in some cases, it's a very narrow, specific definition of, okay, it has to involve this type of accountability with these actors. For some people, it's a much broader kind of community-driven development that has some element of community empowerment type definition. And I think that's maybe not a bad thing, in part because the context really can shape how we're thinking about social accountability and what falls within that definition and what falls outside. So I can give two very specific examples, actually both from the Transparency for Development project. So the first one is maybe talking about our phase one work. So we started out doing this work at a large scale in Tanzania and Indonesia with local civil society organization partners there. And we worked together. We did this co-creation, this co-design of the social accountability approach, which was kind of a modified community scorecard. We went through this really intensive process of kind of figuring out what we meant by social accountability for our purposes. And you can actually read more about this work in a piece that's linked, I believe, to this video called Citizen Voices Community Solutions, where we talk about some of the principles that we use to define what this social accountability approach was. But even after doing that, we designed this kind of modified community scorecard. And much later, we came back to try to analyze what it was that communities actually did with the community scorecard process. What were the actions they designed? What did they undertake? Who did they target? And interestingly, even though we defined this overall community scorecard approach as social accountability, when we started digging down into the actions, what we ended up finding was that actually a pretty small fraction of them, a minority, were things that we would actually define as traditional social accountability. So what we ended up finding out was that actually a pretty small fraction of the actions that communities designed and undertook were social accountability actions, or what we would define as traditional social accountability actions. So what I mean by that is a social accountability action, we consider this something that it was an action that was designed to get a government actor or a service provider or someone else to actually fix something that was the responsibility of a government actor or service provider in the first place. So something that kind of fits in either that long or short route, basically the community coming in and saying, here's this problem. Someone on the kind of formal official side should be fixing this, and we're asking you to fix this as, again, a formal either service provider or government official. What we saw was that a lot of the actions that were designed didn't fit that mold, though. They were something like community self-help, where the community said, hey, we're just going to get together and fix this ourselves. Um, in some cases, they were things called substitution. So this is where it was the responsibility of the government or the service provider to fix this problem, but the community decided to come in and have someone else work on it because they really just didn't perceive that the government or service provider would actually fix it even if they tried. And we write all of this up in a paper that will also link to the video called Insights from the Transparency and Accountability Action Plans. We talk about this kind of 4 or 2x2 matrix of the different types of actions, only one of which really fits this social accountability mold. So I think this is one example of a program that was defined and designed to be social accountability. But because of the context that communities were working in, the types of problems they were trying to solve, and I think the type of pushback that they were sometimes getting from local officials and service providers, they ended up taking actions that we wouldn't define as traditional social accountability. So that's one example of how actually doing this type of work and seeing what was happening, especially around the dynamics and the will to engage and things like that from different actors, I think changed how we thought about what is social accountability. A second example actually comes from the second phase of our work. So after doing this kind of large scale model in Indonesia and Tanzania, we took some of our learnings from that community scorecard and decided to adapt it and test it at a much smaller scale in 3 additional countries, in Ghana, Malawi, and Sierra Leone. And one of the adaptations that we made was to work with CSOs who identified local, so generally district level government champions. These were people who expressed an interest in engaging with communities on social accountability, and said, you know, these are issues I care about. I want to be engaged. So at key moments after communities had gone through the scorecard process, the district officials, these government champions, kind of came in and actually engaged with them, provided them advice, but also were there to respond to requests from the communities. Back in my history and my work on social accountability, I think for a long time, I had concerns about this idea of kind of, I guess, forcing government officials into a social accountability intervention. I took much more of an approach of, okay, well, this needs to be open. It needs to be something that communities identify as something that they want to include in their social accountability approach. Because maybe the local government officials are actually not champions. Maybe they're not willing to engage. And why do we build that into the intervention and the definition of social accountability if that's the case? I think this experience of working in Ghana and Malawi and Sierra Leone really changed my perspective. And the research results that we have, especially from Ghana and Sierra Leone, show that, you know, identifying true government champions and engaging them in the process of social accountability can actually have the potential to lead to really positive outcomes. We saw a number of the actions that communities designed get further, in part because they were engaging with government officials that were supportive of that work. We also saw that they took what I would call kind of more risks with their actions, rather than saying, well, we're just going to do this ourselves because we don't feel like we have the connection to a district health officer to be able to support this work. They had the district health officer in the room. And so they could go to them and say, we need your help with this. This is something that's not working. So I think that's a second example. And we talk a bit more about this in our paper. Again, another piece that's linked to this video. where this role of government champions is something that, at least from my perspective, traditionally, I don't necessarily think of as social accountability. But over the course of doing this work, because the people who were involved, these government champions who were involved, had that will to engage and that motivation to actually work with communities, these different context factors that are quite important, it did end up changing how I thought about social accountability. So yeah, I think those are two examples, and I think important examples of how social accountability, the way we think about it, can change as we do this work. And I would say the one thing that's really important, especially as a researcher, but also as a practitioner, is to kind of leave ourselves open to that learning process ourselves. As we're working on social accountability, we may go in with certain preconceived notions about what is defined as social accountability and what's not. But sometimes by kind of opening up that definition and allowing ourselves to see how different things like the people and the place and the process can change that, um, it does allow for, I think, a more expansive definition of social accountability, that may lead us towards conclusions and understandings of what might work better in some places in some moments of time.